This book is written to the very zealous, faithful tens of thousands of Jews who left the captivity land where they were up on the shore of the Chebar River, up there where Ezekiel was and up where Daniel was, and they walked 600 miles back, risking their lives to go back to the promised land, back to their land after 70 years of captivity. So this is a very dedicated group. The majority, the millions, stayed back. Only a few tens of thousands came. The rest of them stayed there and were assimilated into the Jewish communities that still persist in Iraq, Iran, and all through there. But this is the group that came back. And this letter was written by a prophet who returned with them and was challenging, as it says at the top, their spiritual indifference. You see, it's not just the carnal, the wicked, the profane that God has to challenge. It's also the zealous and the dedicated. Because sometimes we get a little indifferent to that. And I'm going to start reading. In fact, I'm going to read a lot of this. It was such a blessing that I just didn't know where to stop. And so I just thought I'd read it all. There are defining moments that shape the course of history. We remember many of them. Some of you might remember when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Crossing the Rubicon used to be quite a big statement. People don't even know what it means nowadays. But when he crossed the Rubicon River, he took his legions inside the line of no crossing. If you know anything about history, the generals could not bring the legionnaires inside the circle of Rome because the Republic was not a military thing, and it was run by the tribunes and the consuls and the proconsuls and all those people. But he brought his legions inside the river, crossed the Rubicon. And what that was throwing the gauntlet down, and that was the beginning of setting the stage, as it says here, for the Roman Empire as we know it. And that's why he got assassinated, because he became the princeps. He became the chief, the emperor. Another event was young Martin Luther's hammer on the Wittenberg church doors as they rang out a message that altered the course of the church to this day. When Hitler invaded Danzig at the end of August in 1939, it was England's response to that invasion that shaped Western history for the past nearly 60 years. Likewise, in redemptive history, that's the history of God's work in people, the response of the Jews to a message they heard on September 1st, 520. Now, it isn't very often that God gives us the day, the date, and all. I mean, there are 4 sermons that Haggai preached, and each one he dates them for us. 4 specific dates. This one was on September 1st, 520. And it shaped the course of biblical history. In 23 short days, what had not happened in 16 long years took place. So these people all came back all excited, and they were going to rebuild the temple, and they came back and they got all caught up with building their own houses. And they forgot God's house. In fact, it says in Haggai that the ceilings of their houses were made of the finest cedar. Now, I think that was mentioned because if you read in Ezra, it says that they ordered cedar for the Lord's house, and somehow it didn't quite get in the Lord's house. It got into their house, you know. And so it's really a turning point, because after this sermon on September 1st, 520 B.C., 23 days later, the temple was on its way. That's interesting. The second temple was started. The first temple was Solomon's, and it was destroyed in 586 B.C. Herod later would not build a new temple. He didn't build the third temple, but rather he expanded and embellished the second temple. That's Zerubbabel's temple. Zerubbabel was the fellow that brought back this horde of people, and Haggai is the one that preached to Zerubbabel's people, and this was the second temple. And this was the beginning of the temple, the one that Christ was dedicated in, that he baffled the wise leaders, the religious rulers of the day, that he came and cleaned and he preached in. This is the temple of Christ, the apostles. It's the one that was destroyed in AD 70. This was truly a turning point in history when these people responded to this message. All of this is recorded in the 37th book of the Old Testament. Haggai stands at the front of the last division of the Old Covenant or Old Testament books. This is because the structure of the Old Testament is very symmetrical. Okay, I wrote it down for you, but let me tell you about it. You can just imagine 3 triangles. I think it's just fascinating how God put the Bible together. The first piece of the Bible has 17 books in it, and those are the books of history. And the first section are the 5 Old Testament books, the Pentateuch, the big books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, where most people get worn down in their reading. But the books of history aren't just those. There are a total of 17 because there are 12 more books of history that start with Joshua and end with Esther. Of those, 9 of them were written before the children of Israel were carried off into exile. 3 were written when they got back, returned from exile. Those 3 that were after were Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Then the other end of the bookend of the Old Testament has also 17 books in it. 17 in the front, 17 in the back. And the 17 in the back are all about prophecy. There are no history books in there. Daniel's not a book of history, it's a book of prophecy. And those prophetic books have 5 big ones at the front. They're called the major prophets. Then they have 12 little ones called the minor prophets. But what's interesting is, just like in the history books, 9 of the minor prophets were written before they were hauled off into exile, and 3 were written after. We're at the first of the 3 that were written after the exile: Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So you have two bases here, history and prophecy, but right in the center of the Old Testament are 5 books of poetry. And as I wrote in the notes here, those 5 books deal with the heart of Jewish worship. They deal with pain. That's the book of Job. They deal with worship. That's the book of Psalms. They deal with living every day. That's Proverbs. They deal with the big things of life. That's Ecclesiastes. And they deal with love. That's the Song of Solomon. And what's interesting is God says you can have lots of history and you can have lots of prophecy, but if it never impacts your heart and your life, you're kind of missing something. And that's the pinnacle, the center of the whole Old Testament is around worship and life and living life every day and loving God and truly knowing how to go through the pain of life. Well, that was a brief note on symmetrical construction of the Bible. It's very interesting. But at the bottom, the term pre-exilic prophets means that they were sent by God to challenge His people in the north before the fall of Samaria in 722 BC and in the south before the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. At first, some of these men wrote giant books, namely Isaiah and Jeremiah. Others directed God's word against the pagan nations around Israel, like Obadiah, who spoke to Edom, who were the descendants of Esau. You know, if you think about it for a minute, and I am thinking about this myself, all the enemies of Israel were related to them. Did you ever think about that? The Amalekites were descendants of Esau, as well as the Edomites, the Midianites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Arabs today, who are poised lethally at the throat of Israel. All of them are descendants of Abraham. You know what? The things we struggle with most are the things that we allow to grow in our life, our own lusts, our own desires. I'll tell you what, Satan doesn't bother me half as much as I bother myself. You know, he doesn't need to do a lot because of my own weaknesses that I allow to grow up and be enemies and adversaries and nemesis in my life. But Obadiah is written against Edom. Jonah and Nahum are against the nation of Nineveh. But some of these prophets, and now I'm on the top of the second page, targeted the northern kingdom of Israel, as in Hosea and Amos. They both preached the north. Others directed their message by the Lord and spoke to Judah in the south. The ones that spoke to the southern kingdom were Joel, Micah, and Zephaniah. Some wrote during the exile, Ezekiel and Daniel. But now it's time to address the exiles returning. To this group, God raises up 3 prophetic voices: Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. The 2 servant leaders' voices, Ezra the priest and Nehemiah the governor. So if you think about it, even though Ezra and Nehemiah are not at the end of the Bible in the flow of the books, actually Ezra and Nehemiah are contemporaries with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi in the same end period of Israel's Old Testament life.